we can welcome our first speaker up, Kirsten Morehouse. Advised by Mazrin Hanaji with a second reader, Mina Chikara, and the title of her talk will be, All Human Groups Are Human, but Some Are More Human Than Others, a comprehensive analysis of the implicit human-animal stereotype towards racial and ethnic human groups.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Throughout history, we've seen a persistent false belief, the belief that some humans are more human than others. Of course, this belief is blatantly false. By definition, all humans, regardless of the social groups they belong to, are equally human. Saying otherwise is like saying that P is more a letter than Q. It's just not true. Spotlight. Okay. And indeed, when participants are asked to report whether white and non-white groups, like white and black, are equally human, over 93% of all participants and 97% of white participants state that both groups are equally human. This fact seems to be so obvious that we might even wonder why 100% of participants didn't endorse this belief. And yet there's other work demonstrating that some groups are seen as less evolved or less capable of having secondary emotions like grief or pride than others. And these related beliefs, although they don't directly tap into beliefs of humanists, tell us that some people might still think that some groups are more human than others. We also know from over 30 years of research in implicit social cognition that there's often a disconnect between explicit beliefs, which are fairly controllable and accessed via self-report, and beliefs that are revealed on implicit measures that tap into more automatic and less controllable forms of cognition. So the question is, even if participants declare that all groups are equally human on self-report measures, does the belief that some groups are more human still reside in people's minds? And if so, can it be observed on measures of implicit cognition? So in my second year project, I conducted a series of 12 experiments with more than 60,000 participants. But don't worry, for the sake of time today, I'm just going to be sharing the highlights. In particular, I'll share 4 key results. So to test this question, are some groups more human than others, we primarily relied on human-animal IATs. These IATs asked participants to sort stimuli representing white and non-white groups, like white and black in this example, and stimuli representing the concepts human and animal. For us, the key question is whether participants were faster when white and human shared a response key, or when human and black shared a response key. In other words, we're interested in whether white and non-white groups are equally and automatically associated with human and animal. But before I share the results, let's first orient ourselves to the graphs. So this red dotted line represents the 0 point or no bias. If the data fall along this line, it means that both groups were equally associated with human. If, however, the data fall above the dotted line, this means that white was more associated with human. By contrast, if the data fall below the dotted line, this means that black was more associated with human. But for ease of interpretation, I've plotted the data in terms of Cohen's d rather than IAT scores, and I've broken down the data by participant self-identified race. So what did we find? Are both groups equally associated with human? Among black participants, the answer is yes. Black participants showed no bias for their own group. Instead, they accurately associated both groups with human and animal equally. But what about white participants? Do they also assign human to both groups equally? In short, no. Unlike black participants, white participants displayed a moderate white equals human association with a solid Cohen's d of 0.67. In other words, white participants inaccurately associated human more with their own group and black more with animal. Now let's pause for a second and unpack what this means. It means that white participants' implicit beliefs about who is human not only were in conflict with their own explicitly held beliefs, but also in conflict with a factual reality. Now, this initial result raises another important question. Is this just a black-white effect? Perhaps because of the unique history of black-white relations in the United States. That is, are other non-white groups seen as less human relative to white? To test this, we additionally compared white to other prominent racial and ethnic groups, like Asian American in the United States, as well as other national groups like Chinese and Japanese. So what did we find? Here's the data from the black-white contrast I showed you earlier. As you can see, data from white participants provided strong evidence that this is not simply a black-white effect. Instead, the effect emerged consistently in every comparison tested. In fact, the strength of this effect was just as strong when Hispanic was compared to white, Asian, Chinese, and Japanese as when it was compared to black. Now, this robustness is noteworthy given that these groups vary in their history and their stereotype content. So although this white equals human effect emerged reliably both across white participants and also across race and nationality contrasts, we conducted additional experiments to further test the robustness of this effect. For example, one question you might be asking yourself is, were there multiple representations of animal, and did this matter? Animals vary greatly in their valence, this dimension of positivity and negativity, with cuddly pets on the positive end to things like vermin on the negative end. However, we found that this white equals human effect was not an artifact of how we represented animal. Instead, and this was a surprise even to us, this effect persisted when animal was represented 6 different ways, including as cuddly pets, farm animals, wild animals, vermin, and even terms like beast and brute. So, although these data speak to the robustness of this effect, the IET is an inherently relative measure. As such, any single IET cannot tell us whether this effect was driven by the associations between human and white or animal and non-white. Any single IET can also not determine whether this effect was driven by the semantic meanings that underlie human and animal or by their evaluative components. In other words, we also want to know whether this white equals human effect emerged because white is often seen as more positive or good relative to black. So to test this, we replaced the classic human-animal IET, where human is compared to the relatively negative animal attribute with other IETs. Specifically, we compared human to other non-human attributes that varied in their valence. These attributes included things like robots, God, and dessert. Now, for most people, the concepts of God and dessert are pretty positive. So the question is, does this white equals human effect persist even when the contrast to animal is removed and replaced with something positive? Here again is the data from the black-white condition, with now the meta-analytic estimate across studies plotted. If this white equals human effect was really driven by the associations between black and animal, or by valence, then we should expect the effect to be much weaker when human is compared to other non-human attributes. However, this is not what we find. Instead, we find strong evidence that white is human, even in contrast to other attributes. This result tells us that white participants are willing to assign white to human, even when it means assigning attributes like God or dessert to black. In other words, it's not that white participants were denying positive attributes to non-white groups. It's that they're assigning this privileged concept of human to themselves. Data from a similar experiment where animal was compared to other attributes like robot, ghost, or toxin indicate also that black is not associated with animals specifically. Instead, it seems to be a case that black is considered to be less human. So these data are important because they suggest that these stereotypes are more likely driven by in-group favoritism among high-status groups, like white participants in the United States, rather than a tendency to assign non-white groups with animal. And although these data don't point to out-group derivation, it's important to remember that in-group favoritism or lifting up members of our own group but not others are also significant contributors to group disparities. So overall, I presented data from over 60,000 participants across 12 experiments, but I hope that you'll leave with 4 results in mind. First, on self-report measures, participants overwhelmingly affirmed the fact that all groups are equally human. And yet, white participants consistently and inaccurately associated human more with their own group and animal more with non-white. Non-white participants, by contrast, don't show the same bias for their own group, highlighting the interplay between in-group and status in modulating these stereotypes. Fourth and finally, this effect seems to be driven by a tendency to associate human with white, rather than a tendency to associate non-white with animal. Ultimately, these findings are important because among the simplest ways to provide equality to groups is to see all human groups as equally human. And yet these data show that white individuals do not. We hope that these findings will serve as a basis to understand the societal context that may produce and maintain this non-factual stereotype. Thank you to my committee, my collaborators, and to you for my attention. So clearly I was excited because I was 1 minute faster than normal, so we have time for some extra questions. Yes.
So I wondered about what white means in your study. So were all of them Anglo-Saxon, US-born white Americans? And so, like, in other words, if you were to take white, like racially white people from, let's say, the Middle East that came here last year, do they have the same kind of biases? Do you think where like they might have suffered a lot from white people there themselves. So like, do you think that's correct? Like, you made essentially a parallelism between white and hegemonic in a sense, and so if you're white and non-hegemonic, do you think you see the same kind of bias between one and the other?
So is your question comparing two white groups to each other, or looking at like white participants from the Middle East, whether they would show the same tendency to associate white with human?
Essentially, what is the limit of your whiteness? And that depending on where you put that boundary, do you think it would shift the kind of implicit biases that they have?
Yeah, so I don't have data from the Middle East, but I'll say two things. The first is that this idea of in-group seems to be really important. So we also had white Americans do the same task, except rather than having white and non-white, it was white and American and Canadian, and you see that white participants show the exact same thing. So I think it would be more a function of the status of the group. So for example, if I think it would just depend on whether, like you're saying, white individuals in other countries were the groups that have been historically suppressed. In those cases, I don't think that white participants necessarily would show the exact same thing. It seems to be more of like a culturally specific thing. So for example, in East Asia, we see the exact same thing with Asian participants. So East Asian participants from East Asia show an Asian equals human effect. So it seems to be really culturally specific rather than this idea of just white in general is what's driving this effect. It just so happens to be that in the US, white individuals are one of the more socially dominant groups. Yeah.
I have a great talk, by the way. I have a question that's, I think, quite similar to what Esty asked. So, since you're connecting your findings to status and like in-group bias and the interaction between the two, maybe within white participants there might be some groups who show greater bias than others, like as a function of gender, ideology, or status. Yes. So, could you elaborate on that a little?
Yes, I will go to one of my 70 supplemental slides. I'm not kidding. Yes, so there's certainly, so among white participants, it doesn't seem to be the fact that there are some subgroups that don't show the effect, but there are certainly some groups who show elevated effects. So for example, politically conservative, self-identified politically conservative people show the effect to a stronger degree. Oops. Sorry, I have too many supplemental slides. So the two big ones that emerge consistently across IET comparisons are gender and conservative ideology. So men show this effect to a stronger degree than women and self-identified conservatives. You said it, not me. Other things like education, religion, and age don't seem to consistently predict. However, we have also done some with SDO, and we show that in some contrasts, like the white-black and the Hispanic-white, we do see that people higher on SDO are also showing this effect to a stronger degree. Okay.
Right. Yeah, also, I love that. So one of the conclusions you drew up along the way was that black people are treated as less human than white people. By the same token, we can infer that black people are more, in these evaluations, treated as more animal-like, more godlike, and more dessert-like. Can you comment on those?
Yeah.
How was it interpret those?
Yeah, absolutely. So and I wish I had more time to go through those studies, because essentially what we were doing is we were trying to understand whether this tendency to associate with white, like with human, is driving this effect, or black with animal, exactly like you're saying. On a classic human-animal IET, there's no way to really disentangle them. But the idea with adding those different contrasts was basically to say, okay, if we keep the white and human contrast consistent, but now we vary it such that black is associated with, like you said, desserts or something. What that's supposed to be showing us is that it doesn't seem like the association between black and animal is really what's the important thing, because once we have an IET where animal is compared to other non-human attributes like animal, robot, animal, toxin, we see that the effect basically goes away, meaning that it's not like there doesn't seem to be a really strong semantic relationship between black and animal, because if that were the case, if we removed the human contrast and replaced it with something else, you would still expect there to be something to be there, because that relationship should still exist. But yeah, that was sort of the rationale behind it.
Time for one more question.
Okay, sorry.
This builds on Brian's question. I'm curious whether you have data or speculation about where this comes from. in particular because it's really about, for your white participants, white human rather than non-white animal. I could imagine, it's easy for me to imagine how in media or popular culture there might be depictions of non-whites as animals.
Yeah.
But it's harder for me to figure out what is the relevant input that, in the absence of any pairing with animal, just makes white more human for whites. So should we be thinking about social cultural media inputs or some other type of ontogeny for this?
Yeah, and I think that the role of metaphors is something that's definitely really interesting. And we actually tried to avoid animal exemplars that were tapping into these metaphors. But I think the way that I've sort of been interpreting, obviously I would need more data, is that one of the ways that we can signal that our own group is more human is by making other groups something else, in this case animal. But I think that there are so many examples throughout history where it's so varied and there are so many different ways to subjugate other groups. But I will say, in terms of what might be driving this, so for the American-Canadian example I mentioned earlier, we actually don't see any demographic differences. So there aren't any differences across ideology. There aren't any differences across gender. So it might be the case that for groups where this us versus them is maybe a little bit more relevant, or especially in this, it's this kind of the same sort of thinking that might manifest among people who are relatively more dominant in groups that seems to be driving this effect. That's also why we see relationships between SDO in some of these contrasts, but interesting not in the Asian white contrast. So it seems like there might be something different driving the effect in that instance.
Thank you.
Okay.